I've covered a lot of ET encounter cases on this channel over the years. I've also covered quite a few ghost and poltergeist type cases, though rarely do I get a chance to cover cases that overlap. I was recently reading Jerome Clark's book, The Emergence of a Phenomenon, UFOs from the Beginning through 1959, and in that book he discussed a high strangeness case from Washington, in which a driver claims he observed ETs and a ghostly apparition in the same place at the same time. I wanted to find out more, so I contacted Albert Rosales, the author of the Humanoid Journals. As it turned out, two investigators, David W. Akers and William Vogel, both with the Center for UFO Studies, or CUFOS, were on the scene the very next day interviewing witnesses. As well, another researcher, Greg Long, also investigated the case and would ultimately write of it in his 1990 book, examining the Earthlight theory, the Yakima UFO microcosm, which was cited by Clark in his write-up. It should be noted that depending on the source, the date of the incident is either December 11, 1975 or December 14, 1975. Both have been listed as the event date, though December 14th, a Sunday, seems the more likely one based on the events of the case. As well, the name of the witness was either Bob LeDuc or Jim Miller, again depending on the source. In keeping with Clark and Long's write-up, I'll just refer to him as Jim Miller. Toppenish Ridge, Washington. A young man, Jim Miller, and his girlfriend had just attended a Christmas party earlier in the evening. This would have been December 13th, a Saturday, which is why I settled on this date. Not too many people throw parties on a Wednesday. After dropping her at her place, Miller turned off US 97 and began his familiar journey home along lonely gravel pumphouse road, which runs along the northern slopes of Toppenish Ridge in the Yakima Indian Reservation. As there were no streetlights and lots of open pastures on either side of the stretch, to say it was dark would be an understatement. About a mile up the road, Miller was surprised to see, in his headlights, a roan-colored cow and her two calves beelining toward him. It appeared to him that the cow was bawling and looking back over its shoulder, apparently trying to make sure that one of its calves was following. Something had frightened the animals, but what that something was did not make itself visible in the headlights. Miller slowed his truck to avoid hitting them and then carried on. Moments later, as he neared the top of a small rise, he observed three figures standing on the left-hand side of the road. He initially assumed them to be people in trouble. He reasoned that maybe their vehicle had broken down and they were walking to the nearest establishment to call somebody. Remember, this was 1975. Happy to assist, Miller reduced his speed and began to pull up alongside them. Suddenly, one of the figures standing in the ditch on the side of the road bounded out onto the road in a 15-foot floating slow-motion stride to a point just past the center of the road. The figure, apparently a male, was about 7 feet tall. He slowly put his arms above his head. An uncomfortable, ominous feeling descended over Miller. Something wasn't right about the situation, and he decided that it would be in his best interest to not stop and just keep going. His truck approached to within several feet of the figure, and Miller could finally see the man clearly. He was extremely thin and wore tight black clothing with white bands at each wrist and ankle. A white trapezoid, which Miller took to be insignia, was on his chest, and black boots or something similar was on his feet. The man had a very long face and a long, pointy nose. The skin on the face was very white, as if covered with flour. The upper lip appeared to be pulled back in a permanent snarl, and fine teeth were visible. The lower lip was either missing or very small. The man's shoulder-length hair was brownish, reddish-blonde, and very matted and stringy. The fingers on both of the man's bare hands were long, and he appeared to be grasping something purple in his left hand. The thing had a wire on it which appeared to run down the figure's arm. Miller noticed that the other two individuals remained close together at the side of the road. They were wearing the same kind of clothing, complete with white markings. Upon seeing them up close, Miller became terrified. He swerved around the figure. As he did, the giant man, or whatever it was, turned sideways. It never moved its arm nor changed its facial expression. Miller tore off up the road into the darkness. He wanted to look into his rearview mirror, but was too frightened. He feared that he might see them behind him. He continued to drive as fast as he could, hoping to put as much distance between himself and them. Sadly, it seems his evening of weirdness was only getting started. A few moments later, Miller suddenly became aware of something behind him. In his rearview mirror, something was following him. As he looked, he saw an elongated, lighted aerial object that somehow appeared behind his truck. He had no idea where it came from. It seemed to be keeping pace, blinking on and off several times as it did so. Suddenly, the inside of his truck and a 10-foot wide area around the vehicle were flooded with light, as if the dome light had been turned on. The intensity of the illumination became so bright that it actually masked the instrument panel lights and revealed dead insects stuck to the windshield. And this is when things got really weird. Out of the corner of his eye, Miller could see the shadow of a person sitting in his passenger seat beside him. In that moment, out of sheer fright, it didn't occur to Miller how this person came to be sitting there, only that he thought he recognized him. Almost intuitively, he knew the figure was that of a close male friend of his, who was around his age. He recognized the shape of the friend's head and his familiar coat. How did this friend get there? What was going on? What was the light, Miller wondered. And then he heard a voice in his mind. It was female. He heard it clearly. Drive recklessly, because they can't afford for them to be the cause of you getting hurt, the voice said. Miller's passenger, the friend, then turned his head and looked directly at him. He then leaned forward and looked up at the light pouring in through the windshield. He then leaned back, wiped his eyes, leaned forward as if to stand up, and then vanished. As soon as he did, the light disappeared, and a sick feeling came over Miller that someone he knew had died. He was overcome with sadness. He didn't understand where it came from. This, matched with his confusion and overwhelming fright of seeing the beings and being chased by the light, needless to say, he was a mix of emotions when he finally arrived at home. He immediately ran inside and woke his parents. They could see that he was quite frightened. He told them of what he saw, the giants, the strange lights, the ghostly appearance of a friend who, as far as he knew, was alive and well, in the passenger seat, and the female voice. That morning it came to Miller's attention that the friend he had witnessed in the car that evening had actually been fatally shot that very night. David Akers and William Vogel had arrived in the area the very next day after learning of the sighting from Miller's parents. They indicated that their son was in a state of shock when he arrived home. He told them of seeing the friend, who they later discover had actually passed away around the time Miller claims to have seen him. Akers and Vogel were able to confirm the name of the friend and that he indeed did pass away. They also spoke to the witness, his girlfriend, and some neighbors. They were able to go out to the location and examine it. In March 1976, 3 months later, tribal police were called out to a farm to investigate a disturbance. The family had reported seeing 2 tall, black-clad men chasing their cattle in the pasture. Officers arrived on scene but were not able to find the culprits. Curiously, this farm was only 10 miles from where Miller had his encounter. This is one of those cases that has a little bit of everything. UFOs, strange leaping entities chasing cattle, a ghostly apparition, post-death visitation, and even possibly a guardian angel. The late author and researcher John Keel was a big proponent of the idea that everything in the paranormal was connected. UFOs, ghosts, cryptids. He believed that they were part and parcel of the same thing, and this case really does kind of bolster that sentiment. Jerome Clark believed that the figures Miller encountered in the road were modern-day versions of the Spring Heel Jack character that terrorized residents in England in the late 1800s, given their appearance and how at least one of them seemed able to leap a great distance with relative ease. It is curious that Clark omits any mention of Miller's phantom passenger, possibly because it completely muddles what is, up to that point, a pretty standard ET encounter case. While post-death visitation cases are nothing new, I've never quite heard of one taking place whilst the witness was presumably in the process of being snatched up by non-human entities. That's absolutely a first for me. Further, the sudden appearance of a female voice in his mind encouraging him to, quote, drive recklessly because they can't afford for them to be the cause of you getting hurt, seems to indicate a guardian angel type figure, and an apparent awareness by this guardian angel of the rules in which these beings must abide. They can't afford for them to be the cause of you getting hurt. Why? What would happen if Miller got hurt? Is there some kind of higher power which doles out punishment to those non-human entities who injure humans? Or is Miller part of something larger that only the beings are privy to? If you look at it another way, the guardian angel, if that's what it is suggesting to Miller that in order to save himself, he must behave in a way that might injure himself, which doesn't sound much like something a guardian angel would say. And what was the ghostly friend doing there, saying his goodbyes after a violent death? Or was he there for another reason? Did his presence somehow play a role in the events of that evening in some way? Was the light observed by Miller coming from the UFO? Or was it in fact part of his friend's passing? Was he somehow bearing witness to his friend going into the light, a common fixture in so many NDE reports? Had the being somehow facilitated Miller's ability to see the unseen, to glimpse a reality that exists beyond this one? Maybe, in fact, this was the entire point of the encounter.